Alright, this is called Sedition and Stockholm Syndrome. It's an analysis of the 13th chapter of George Orwell's Burmese Days, as well as Neurotic Nihilism 4.1. So, with that, the 13th chapter of George Orwell's 1934 work Burmese Days is a whirlwind in cases of power dynamics as well as subsequent masks and manipulation. Entering the chapter is once again a meeting between the English Flory and Burmese native, Dr. Verswamy. In their meeting, the doctor reveals he has figured more regarding the looming conspiracy towards him on the part of the local magistrate, IV.1, vying for an election to the European Club in the area. Climbing up the ladder through sowing literal sedition to levy attacks at the doctor, supposedly on the doctor's behalf. And once again, the analogy of crocodiles striking at the weakest spot is rephrased, reformed to the new light of Flory siding with Verswamy in opposition to the magistrate, as being an English Oriental would technically supersede the current amassed authority of Upokoyan's and general conventionality. However, since the initial dialogue regarding the crocodile, Flory gained what would seem to be a new Achilles heel, with her arrival to India from Paris and his meeting of Elizabeth. That arrival being the catalyst for the rest of the chapter and rationale behind choosing the doctor, even if the convention is to let such petty native businesses, happen regardless, as it served to only increase the idea of needing the control the English Orientals had. Quote, he knew why. It was because Elizabeth, by coming into his life, had so changed it and renewed it that all the dirty, miserable years might never have passed. Her presence has changed the whole orbit of his mind. She had brought him back to the air of England, unquote. While a break from English convention on behalf of a native, an act where at the moment Elizabeth's character would seemingly frown towards, the purpose is as it would seem exactly for that, though it's ultimately a seeming nostalgia in her as a mirroring muse, because for so many years, as stated, while not void of companionship, as showcased later in the fully in the chapter, Flory's day-to-day had been miserable, a listless existence of drinking and smoking and going about his duties, waiting to return to England. And during the course of the story, he even almost makes it for just a brief period, only to be called back to Burma, finding himself somehow thankful to be back rather than his country of birth. So with that, the relation of master of servant has historically been one of an inherently dubious quality, given the blatant implication of one authority subjecting another to its own bends. A mundane extreme throughout time of slaves and other such synonyms for servitude. Even Thomas Jefferson had at least one of them as a concubine, fathering a bastard child with a slave being the way we know in his case. It wasn't uncommon. Mahatma May worked as servant to Flory for a massive majority of his time in Burma leading up to the arrival of Elizabeth. Detailed in prior chapters of the book, the relationship between Flory and Mahatma is innately speculative, and Orwell makes no secret the dynamic of their sensual business, the implication in that it began as a form of rape and to an extent remains so, even though over time she may have seemingly become attached. Or, as it would seem in their case, it could have been somewhat of a mutually inclusive hypnosis, like the type described in Matthias Desmond's The Psychology of Totalitarianism within her Stockholm Syndrome. All cards of which, shifted against her favor with Flory, his eyes darting toward Elizabeth as opposed to her conventional comfort. Or, as repeatedly stated in his ideation a few times within the chapter, the decent life he once led, attempting more restraint regarding his whiskey and tobacco-driven habits. The listless living, he believed, and did indeed on some level have, albeit at least only of late. Essentially, vice literally vulgar to the veins, slowed down in relation to what Carl Jung pointed out regarding muses as a mirror-style conduit for what one wants to see in their own reflection. Because Florey's home at this point is Burma, India, though he desires some part of England, which he seems to perceive and project onto Elizabeth as portraying. The comforting capacity that could be there in companionship that seems familiar and similar, and the nostalgia she brings to him, as well as a probable procreative impulse for continued lineage and conventional courtship, And similarly to cutting back on tobacco and alcohol in the presence of Elizabeth, Florey subsequently disregards Malame all the same, or at least initially attempts to, having, quote, ruined her, unquote, by her own as well as general cultural standards and apparent gained attachment. During the week of her initial expulsion, she sent a mere message demanding, 50 rupees, though Florey disregarded it. And so going back to Florey's after a week, Malame's character appears to him at his arrival back at his abode preceding his meeting with Dr. Versawamy. She, and disheveled, plastered with a heavy white mask of makeup on her face, she pleaded for a pity that she seemed to know wouldn't be given, even if felt, Wailing on the floor, Florey in his mind acknowledged that the pain was his doing. However, given the dynamic of power in the hypothetical late-led life, it's next to nothing, until eventually readjusting herself and in solemn bitterness marched down the path away from the house, And the dynamic is encapsulated by Florey as she leaves in his understanding that, quote, it was true, he had robbed her of her youth, unquote. But with his power, concern turns back to his prior pondering, the solipsistic misery wallowing, quote, where is the life that late led I, unquote. Late led, as if dead before I ever left the head.